Captain John Foster sat in the cockpit of his ship, gliding through the quiet emptiness of space. The stars outside shimmered, distant and cold, as he navigated through a routine patrol in the sector. A usual mission, nothing out of the ordinary, until the emergency signal blasted through his comms. Unidentified vessel. Unidentified vessel. The distress call repeated, its tone urgent. John's brow furrowed as he quickly checked his instruments. A ship was in distress, and from the trajectory it was on, it was heading straight for the moon of a nearby planet. No one lived there, but it was a remote location, perfect for a crash landing. He felt the familiar rush of adrenaline course through his veins. This wasn't just a routine patrol anymore. As a trained pilot, he had been through countless emergencies, but something about this felt different, like it was about to turn into something bigger than just a rescue mission. John tapped the comms again, trying to reach the vessel. "This is Captain John Foster, Human Navy. Please respond. We're on our way." The signal crackled for a few seconds, then fell silent. That didn't sound good. He increased his speed, adjusting his ship's course to intercept the distressed vessel. Within moments, he saw it, a small, sleek craft, damaged beyond recognition, drifting towards the moon's surface. He could already tell the ship's condition was dire. One of the engines was smoking, and the hull had deep gashes along its side. Whoever was inside, they were in trouble. "Stay with me," he whispered to himself as his hands moved swiftly over the controls. His heart pounded as he steered his ship closer. The moon's gray surface came into view, rocky and barren, but perfect for a landing. The distress signal stopped abruptly, and John's eyes narrowed. The ship was about to crash. He had to act fast. He lined up his ship, preparing to land with precision. The landing gear extended with a soft wire, and the thrusters fired as he touched down on the cold, dusty surface of the moon. His boots hit the ground moments later, and he wasted no time. A rescue mission meant every second counted. The wrecked ship lay a few hundred yards away, its structure half collapsed. The thick smoke billowed from its vents. There was no sign of life, no movement, no sounds, just the echo of a broken machine in the silent emptiness. John hurried to the wreckage, his boots kicking up dust as he jogged over to the crumpled vessel. The air was thin here, and he could feel the pressure in his chest. He activated his suit's life support system, adjusting the oxygen levels to keep himself steady. Reaching the door of the alien ship, he paused for a moment, scanning for any signs of survivors. There, a faint heartbeat. Just one. John's heart skipped a beat. He wasn't sure who, or what, he was about to find. The alien technology on this ship was like nothing he had ever seen before. He reached for his equipment and carefully pried the door open with a hydraulic tool. The inside of the ship was even more damaged than he had expected. Wires hung loosely from the walls, sparks crackled in the air, and the smell of burnt circuits lingered in the enclosed space. In the corner, lying unconscious, was an alien figure, female, dressed in a strange, dark uniform. Her features were delicate, almost ethereal. He rushed to her side, his mind racing. Was she alive? She had to be. He could still hear the faint heartbeat. Carefully, he lifted her head and checked her pulse. Weak, but steady. "Hang in there," he muttered. His hands moved quickly to assess her injuries. There was a deep gash on her forehead, and her chest rose and fell shallowly. It was clear that she had been through an ordeal, perhaps the crash, or something worse. John gently adjusted her body, making sure she was in a position that would allow for easier breathing. Her long, silver hair was matted with blood, and she groaned faintly, stirring ever so slightly. He checked her pulse again. Still faint, but she was alive. For a moment, he thought he saw her eyes flicker open, but they closed again quickly, her body too weak to respond fully. "Stay with me," John repeated softly. He knew he needed to act fast. He could get her back to his ship, administer first aid, and figure out what had happened later. Right now, all that mattered was getting her help. He reached for his communicator and sent a distress signal to the nearby base, asking for a medical team to be prepared for an emergency evacuation. He then gently lifted the alien woman into his arms, her body light but fragile. The weight of the responsibility was heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know who she was or what she meant to anyone, but she was alive, and that was enough for him to keep pushing forward. With careful steps, he carried her back to his ship. He placed her gently in the medical bay, securing her with the straps for safety. The ship's AI activated immediately, recognizing the emergency situation. Preparing medical protocols, the AI announced in a calm voice, "Please state the nature of the injuries. Severe head trauma, blood loss, possibly internal injuries." John responded quickly, his voice tense but focused. The AI worked swiftly, administering treatments to stabilize her condition. John stood by, watching closely, hoping that she would wake soon, hoping that he hadn't arrived too late. As he watched over her, the only thing that remained in his mind was a single thought. Who was she? And why had she been attacked? As the minutes ticked by, he knew the answers were waiting for him. He just had to be patient. But for now, the most important thing was that she was still alive, and that he could work with. Hours passed. Captain John Foster paced back and forth in the ship's small medbay, his mind racing. The alien woman lay on the examination table, her fragile form still unconscious. The soft hum of the ship's life support system was the only sound in the quiet room. Every so often, the AI would update him on her status, but there was nothing new. Her condition had stabilized, but she had not yet regained consciousness. John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was something about her, something familiar, yet so foreign. The way her silver hair shimmered even in the dim light of the medbay, the grace with which she lay despite her injuries. It felt like she was more than just a survivor of an accident. But what? Who was she? He sighed, sitting down in the chair beside the table. His fingers drummed anxiously on the armrest. He hadn't signed up for this kind of mission. He was just a pilot, a simple one. His job was to fly, to protect, to carry out his orders. But this situation, it was different. He had a responsibility now, a duty to this alien woman. She was the only survivor of the crash, and though she could not speak, John felt a deep sense of connection to her. The ship's AI interrupted his thoughts. "Captain, her vitals are improving. Heart rate, respiration, and brain activity are all within normal parameters." John nodded absently, his eyes never leaving the alien woman. He watched the steady rise and fall of her chest, her breathing slow but even. She was alive, but that was all he knew for sure. Suddenly, a small sound broke the silence, a soft groan. John's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, moving closer to her. Her eyes fluttered open, just slightly at first. John felt his breath catch in his throat. Her eyes, bright, glowing, and an unusual shade of blue, slowly focused on him. She blinked a few times, as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. Then her gaze locked onto his, and she gasped softly, "Where am I?" Her voice was soft but clear, the words heavy with confusion. The alien woman tried to sit up, but her body immediately protested. She winced in pain and fell back against the pillow, her hand instinctively reaching for the injury on her forehead. "Easy," John said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder to help her settle back down. "You're safe. You were in an accident. You're on my ship." The alien woman's eyes darted around the room, as if taking in her surroundings. The sterile white walls, the advanced medical equipment, the strange human who was now speaking to her. She didn't recognize any of it. A look of panic flashed across her face. "My ship?" she murmured, her voice trembling. "Who are you? Where are you from? What happened to me?" John's brow furrowed as he took a step back. Her voice held a note of distress. But more than that, there was fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of losing herself. "My name is Captain John Foster," he replied slowly, trying to ease her tension. I'm from Earth. I found you after your ship crashed. You were the only one I found alive." The alien woman stared at him, her expression unreadable. Her brows furrowed as if trying to process his words. Then she closed her eyes, pressing her fingers to her temples, as though trying to remember something. She hesitated. "I can't remember. I don't remember anything." John's heart went out to her. He knew that feeling, waking up in an unfamiliar place with no memory of who you were, where you came from, or how you got there. But for her, it seemed even worse. Her entire identity was gone, wiped clean. She didn't even know her name. He paused, then spoke softly. "It's okay. You're safe here. You don't have to remember everything right away. We can take it slow." Her eyes snapped back to his, filled with a mix of frustration and fear. "I have to remember. I can't just forget." John nodded, understanding the urgency in her voice. "I get it. But right now, the most important thing is that you're alive. We can work on getting your memory back, one step at a time." The alien woman's hands clenched into fists. She looked away, staring at the ceiling as if searching for something in the empty space above her. "I feel like I'm missing something, like something is just out of reach. I was doing something. I was important. I had a purpose." Her voice wavered, as if the memory was slipping through her fingers like sand. John watched her for a moment, then sat down again in the chair beside the medbay table. "You were important," he said gently. "I can tell. Whatever happened to you, whatever you were meant to do, it's not over. You don't have to do it alone." She met his eyes, her gaze softer now, though still filled with confusion. "I don't know where to start. I don't even know who I am." "You're not alone in this," John repeated. "I'll help you. We'll figure it out together." The alien woman nodded slowly, still uncertain, but a flicker of hope seemed to pass through her. She was still weak, still disoriented, but there was something in her eyes now, a spark that hadn't been there before. She wasn't completely lost. Not yet. John stood up and activated the ship's eye once again. "Can you run a diagnostic on her neural activity? I think she might be able to remember something if we trigger the right pathways." "Affirmative," the AI responded. The soft hum of the ship's systems filled the room again as the AI began its work. As the minutes passed, the alien woman lay still, her eyes closed, her mind working behind the silence. John watched her, wondering what memories she would uncover, what pieces of her past would come flooding back. He didn't know, but he was ready to help her find the answers. Together, they would figure it out. The days that followed were filled with quiet tension. Captain John Foster had his hands full, caring for the alien woman. Despite the ship's advanced medical technology, she remained weak and disoriented, her memory still fragmented. She could recall pieces of her past, small glimpses that came and went like fleeting shadows, but the whole picture remained hidden, locked away deep in her mind. Her name, her identity, and even the purpose of her mission, all of it was a blur. John couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. He had known the risks of taking on a mission like this, but nothing had prepared him for the responsibility of helping someone who had lost everything. There were times when he felt like a stranger in her world, unsure of how to reach her, unsure of how to help her remember. But his determination never wavered. He had to believe that she could recover, that together they could restore what had been lost. Each day, he tried to piece together more of her story. They talked, slowly, carefully, as she shared whatever fragments she could recall. Some days, she would remember the warmth of her home, the laughter of loved ones, and the sense of duty that had driven her. Other days, she would speak of loss, of betrayal, of things she couldn't quite understand. She would begin, her voice hesitant. "I was on a mission. A peace mission. But I don't remember who I was supposed to meet. I don't know why I was there." John listened, never interrupting, giving her the space to speak. It was clear that the more she tried to remember, the more frustrated she became. But he refused to let her give up. The woman was strong, resilient in a way that John admired. Despite her amnesia, she didn't shy away from facing the harsh truths of her past. But there was something else, too, a deeper pain that lingered just beneath the surface. Whenever she tried to reach for the missing pieces, her eyes would cloud with something dark, something that made her pull back, as if afraid of what might be uncovered. He had to find a way to help her unlock that door. But how? One evening, as the two of them sat in the quiet lounge of the ship, John looked at her with a new sense of resolve. "There's something I've been thinking about," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up at him, her eyes still a bit distant. "What is it?" John hesitated for a moment. "There's a procedure, something that could help trigger your memories. It's experimental, but it's worked in similar cases before. If you're willing, I can try it." The alien woman studied him for a long moment, her face unreadable. "And you think it will work?" "I think it might," John replied. "But I can't promise anything. It's risky. It could bring back memories you're not ready to face." She considered his words carefully, her gaze turning inward. He could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to remember, but the fear of what she might uncover held her back. For a long time, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke. "What if the memories are too much to bear? What if they break me?" John's heart softened at her words. "We don't have to rush it. You're in control. But if you're willing, I'll be here. I'll help you through it." Her eyes met his, and for the first time since they'd met, John saw something other than confusion or fear in them. There was trust, a small flicker, but it was there. "Okay," she said, her voice steady. "I'll try. I need to know who I am." John nodded, relieved. "I'll start preparing the procedure. It'll take some time to set up, but it's the best chance we have." Over the next few hours, he worked with the ship's AI to prepare the neural stimulation system. It was designed to help trigger memories in patients suffering from amnesia, using carefully calibrated impulses to stimulate brain activity and potentially access forgotten memories. The technology was untested on non-human species, but it was the only option they had. John double-checked the settings, making sure everything was in place. When he returned to the medbay, the alien woman was waiting, sitting up in bed, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Her eyes were focused, determined, but there was still an edge of fear in them. She had agreed to the procedure, but it didn't mean she wasn't scared. "Are you ready?" John asked, his voice gentle. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "I have to be." John activated the neural stimulation system, and the room was filled with a soft hum as the technology began to work. The alien woman closed her eyes, her body tensing as the pulses began. John stayed by her side, watching carefully, his heart beating in his chest. This was it. This was the moment that could change everything. For a long time, nothing happened. But then, her body jerked slightly, and her eyes shot open, wide with alarm. I remember something," she gasped. John leaned forward, his heart racing. "What do you remember?" Her eyes were wide, unfocused, as if struggling to hold on to the memory. There was a planet, a beautiful place. I was supposed to meet someone there. A leader, someone important." John nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Who were you supposed to meet? Can you remember their name?" She shook her head, her face filled with frustration. "No, it's slipping away again." "Don't worry," John said softly. "You're doing great. Just breathe. Let it come back." But the alien woman's expression grew darker, and she looked away, her mind clearly struggling to hold on to the fragments that were slipping from her grasp. "There's something wrong. I can feel it. But I don't know what it is." John's heart sank. The past was still a mystery, but there was no giving up now. He would help her piece it together, no matter how long it took. The next few days passed in a quiet, tense rhythm. The alien woman, whom John had learned to call Lyra, though she wasn't entirely sure if that was her true name, had become more focused in her attempts to remember. The neural stimulation procedure had helped her recall more fragments, though none of them were complete. Every breakthrough was followed by moments of silence, where Lyra would retreat inward, as though the weight of her past was too much to handle. John could see it in her eyes. The frustration, the struggle, but also a strange sense of determination. She wanted to know who she had been, and though the memories were fragmented, there was a growing sense that something big was about to break through. John spent most of his time by her side, helping her piece things together. He had learned a lot about her in those quiet hours. How she had once commanded a fleet of ships, how she had been part of an intergalactic alliance, and how she had been sent on a peace mission that had gone horribly wrong. She had once been a leader, but now, those memories were just whispers at the edge of her mind. One evening, after another round of the neural procedure, Lyra suddenly sat up straight in her bed, her eyes wide with alarm. John quickly moved to her side. "Lyra, what is it? Are you okay?" he asked, concern filling his voice. She stammered, her hands gripping the edge of the bed as though bracing herself for something. I remember the mission. There was something important, something I was supposed to protect." John's pulse quickened. "What was it? What were you supposed to protect?" Lyra's breath came in quick gasps as she tried to recall more, her brow furrowing in concentration. It was a relic, a powerful artifact, something that could change the balance of the galaxy. I was guarding it. But she trailed off, her voice faltering. John could see the fear building in her eyes again, as though whatever she had just recalled was something that terrified her. "But what?" John urged gently. "Lyra, you're safe now. It's okay to remember." Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper. "But I failed. I failed in my mission. The artifact. I couldn't protect it. It was taken." John felt a chill run down his spine. Taken? By who? She shook her head, her expression twisted in pain. "I don't know. There was someone who was after it. I was betrayed. Someone I trusted. I don't remember their name, but I feel their presence. It haunts me." John's heart raced as he processed her words. An artifact of unimaginable power. Something capable of shifting the balance of the entire galaxy. And it had been taken, stolen, perhaps by someone close to her. A betrayal. He knew this was more than just a crash and a lost memory. Lyra's mission had been much bigger, much more important than either of them had realized. This artifact, whatever it was the key. Whoever had taken it could be planning something terrible, something that could threaten not just her world, but countless others. Lyra closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I failed them. I failed everyone." John placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. "You didn't fail. You're here now, and you're not alone. We'll find this artifact. We'll find the people who took it. You don't have to do this by yourself." She met his gaze, the fear and uncertainty still there, but there was also something else, something like hope. For the first time in days, she seemed to truly see him, not as a stranger, but as an ally. "I don't know where to start," she said, her voice small. "I don't know how to find it." John took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was no longer just about her recovery. This was about stopping something far bigger. A galaxy-changing artifact. A betrayal. They were tangled in a web much larger than either of them had imagined. "We'll start with what you know," John said firmly. "You remember the mission. You remember the artifact. And you remember the betrayal. That's a start." He could see her mind working through the pieces, the confusion still there, but the determination growing stronger. "I need to remember more," she murmured. "I need to understand who I was working for. I need to know who betrayed me." John nodded, sensing the urgency in her words. They couldn't waste any more time. If someone was out there with the artifact, they had to act fast. "We'll get there," he said. "But right now, let's focus on getting you stronger. We can't do anything until you're back to full strength." Lyra nodded, But John could see the deep conflict in her eyes. She wanted to do more. She wanted to dive into the mystery, to solve the puzzle. But she knew, too, that she needed to heal before she could take the next step. As the days passed, John continued to support her, helping her with her physical recovery, while also encouraging her to push her memory further. The neural stimulation sessions continued, slowly bringing more of her past to the surface. Each new memory was like a puzzle piece, fitting into place, but there were still large gaps. Things she couldn't recall, things that felt like they were locked behind a wall. Still, she was getting stronger. Her strength was returning, and so was her resolve. She wasn't the leader she had once been, not yet, but there was a spark inside her, a spark that would not be extinguished. John found himself growing more invested in her recovery, not just as a pilot, but as a friend and an ally. He wasn't sure what this mission would ultimately lead to, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her go through it alone. The days aboard the ship passed in a blur of quiet determination. Captain John Foster had grown accustomed to the routine. He would help Lyra with her physical recovery and assist her in recalling more of her past. Every conversation, every small breakthrough, brought them closer to uncovering the truth of her mission and the powerful artifact she had been protecting. Lyra had regained much of her strength, though she still struggled with the fragmented memories that haunted her. The memories of the artifact, of the betrayal, were growing clearer, but they still eluded her grasp. She could feel that the answers were close, just out of reach. I remember more now," Lyra said one evening, her voice filled with a quiet intensity. John, who had been monitoring her progress, immediately sat beside her. "What do you remember?" Lyra paused, her eyes searching the room as though looking for something hidden in the shadows. "I remember my mission. I was part of a group, an alliance of different races, working together for peace. My role was to protect the artifact, but there was something more. Someone in the alliance wanted it for themselves." John leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Do you know who?" She shook her head, frustration creeping into her voice. "No, I don't remember their name, but I can feel their presence. The betrayal is so clear in my mind. It was someone close to me, someone I trusted." John's heart sank. The more Lyra remembered, the more the stakes seemed to grow. Whoever had betrayed her was still out there, and they were likely after the artifact, if they hadn't already found it. "We need to find out who did this," John said, his voice firm. "You were guarding something important. We can't let whoever betrayed you get away with it." Lyra nodded slowly, her expression troubled. "But where do we even start? The galaxy is vast. There are so many places where the artifact could be. I don't know where to begin." John thought for a moment, his mind racing. He had been a pilot for years, but this was a new kind of mission. This was personal now. Lyra wasn't just a survivor of a crash. She was a key player in something much larger, something that could change the fate of entire worlds. "There's a place," John said finally, his voice steady. "A world not far from here. It's a hub for trade, information, and criminals alike. If anyone knows where the artifact is, it's there." Lyra looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "You think someone on that planet knows?" "I'm sure of it," John replied. "The black market runs deep there. If the artifact's been sold or hidden, that's the place to find it." Lyra's gaze softened, but a hint of doubt remained. "And what if they don't know? What if we're walking into a trap?" John met her gaze, his expression resolute. "Then we'll deal with it. Together." The silence that followed was heavy, but Lyra's uncertainty seemed to fade. She nodded slowly, a spark of determination lighting up her eyes once more. "All right, let's go." The decision had been made. They would head for the black market world. It wasn't a place either of them wanted to visit, but it was their only lead. The ship's engines hummed as John set the course, the stars outside the window blurring into streaks of light as they accelerated toward their destination. Lyra sat quietly beside him, her fingers tapping nervously against her armrest. She still didn't fully trust herself, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't do this without John. He had become more than just a pilot to her. He was her ally, her protector, and perhaps even her friend. "I never expected any of this," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. "I was just doing my job. I didn't think it would turn into something like this." John glanced at her, a small, reassuring smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You didn't ask for this, but you're handling it. We'll find the answers you need." Lyra nodded, her eyes focused on the stars outside the window. "I just want to understand. I want to know what happened to me, to the artifact, to everything." "We'll get there," John said firmly. "One step at a time." The journey to the black market world took several days. During that time, John and Lyra continued to work together, piecing together the story of her past. The closer they got to their destination, the more Lyra's memories seemed to clear. She recalled her time as a leader in the Alliance, her training, the responsibility she had carried for the artifact. She even began to remember the faces of some of her allies, though the memory of the traitor remained stubbornly out of reach. Finally, the black market world loomed ahead. It was a planet that looked like a patchwork of industrial zones, neon lights, and dark alleys from space. Its atmosphere was thick, and its surface was dotted with towering buildings that seemed to stretch into the sky, almost as though they were reaching for something higher. John's ship descended through the atmosphere, and Lyra's heart began to race. She knew this was a dangerous place. It was a world where criminals thrived, where trust was a luxury no one could afford. But it was their best shot at finding the artifact, and she couldn't back down now. "We're here," John said, glancing at the console. "Stay sharp. I'll set us down in a safe area." Lyra took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever was to come. She had no idea what they would find on this planet, but one thing was certain. The hunt for the artifact had just begun. The ship touched down on the black market planet with a soft thud. The bustling city below seemed alive, a chaotic web of neon lights, towering structures, and shadows that stretched long into the darkened streets. The air was thick with the scent of oil, sweat, and the hum of activity. John Foster couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he powered down the ship's engines. Lyra, sitting beside him, looked out the window with a mixture of curiosity and caution. She had never been to a place like this before. The atmosphere was oppressive, the streets filled with people who wore expressions of suspicion and distrust. The planet was a haven for those who wanted to keep their secrets hidden, and it was exactly where they needed to be. "Ready?" John asked, glancing at her. Lyra hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The airlock hissed open, and they stepped into the unknown. The bustling streets outside the ship were filled with vendors, mercenaries, and travelers from all corners of the galaxy. Lyra's senses were on high alert. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, and she didn't like it. It wasn't the kind of place where strangers were welcome, and it certainly wasn't the kind of place where someone like her could remain unnoticed for long. John led the way, his hand resting on the handle of his sidearm, though it was clear that he wasn't expecting trouble. At least not yet. The two of them moved through the crowded streets, weaving between merchants peddling goods and shady individuals whispering in dark corners. It felt like the kind of place where danger was always just around the corner, but John had been here before. He knew the rules. "There's a bar nearby," John said, his voice low. "It's a good place to start. If anyone knows anything about the artifact, it'll be someone there." Lyra nodded, still scanning their surroundings. She was more than ready to get to the point. "Let's go." The bar was tucked away in a narrow alley, the door hidden behind a rusted sign that read, "The Black Star." Inside, the dim lighting created a haze of smoke and shadow. The air smelled of cheap alcohol and the faint odor of unwashed bodies. It wasn't a place for casual conversation, and Lyra immediately felt her nerves heighten. John pushed open the door and stepped inside, with Lyra following closely behind. The room was filled with a mix of rough-looking characters. Some were sitting at the bar, others in booths, speaking in low voices. A couple of bounty hunters exchanged glances as they passed by, and a gambler in the corner eyed them suspiciously. "Stay close," John murmured, leading her toward the bar. The bartender, a bulky man with a scar running down his face, looked up as they approached. His eyes flicked from John to Lyra, sizing them up before speaking. "What do you want?" he grunted, his voice low and rough. John leaned forward, trying to keep things casual. "We're looking for information about a relic, a powerful artifact. Have you heard anything?" The bartender's expression didn't change, but he seemed to consider the question for a long moment. Finally, he gave a short nod. "Maybe. Depends on what you're offering." John reached into his jacket and pulled out a small pouch, the glint of credits inside catching the light. "We've got something to trade." The bartender's eyes narrowed, but the sight of the credits seemed to soften his stance. "All right. I know a guy. He deals in rare artifacts. Sometimes he might have what you're looking for." John didn't hesitate. "Where can we find him?" The bartender gestured vaguely toward the back of the room. "He's got a table near the wall. You'll know him when you see him." John nodded and motioned for Lyra to follow him. The two of them made their way across the room, passing by groups of whispering individuals, until they reached the table the bartender had mentioned. A tall man with a long coat sat there, his face hidden in the shadows. He was watching them intently, but he didn't say a word. John stopped in front of him. "We're looking for a specific artifact, a powerful relic. Do you know anything about it?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small data pad, scanning it quickly. He looked at John and Lyra with a skeptical expression. "I might know something," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But you're asking about something that's not exactly common. Why should I tell you?" John's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his tone calm. "Because we can make it worth your while." The man tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his options. After a long pause, he leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "I've heard rumors. There's a buyer, someone from the Outer Rim, looking for a relic just like the one you're talking about. But it's not easy to get. There's a lot of people looking for it." Lyra stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Where is it? We need to know." The man's eyes flicked over to her, studying her for a moment. There was something calculating in his gaze, but it didn't faze her. She was ready to do whatever it took to get answers. "Listen, I don't know exactly where it is," the man said slowly, "but I can tell you this. The person you're looking for is dangerous. They're not someone you want to cross." John leaned in, his voice low and serious. "We don't have time for threats. Just tell us what you know." The man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "All right. There's a trade scheduled. Tomorrow night. The artifact will be exchanged on a station just beyond the outer moon. If you want to find it, that's where you need to go." John's pulse quickened. This was it. The next step in their search. They finally had a lead. He placed a few credits on the table, enough to satisfy the man's curiosity. "Thanks for the information." Without waiting for a response, John turned and gestured for Lyra to follow him. As they left the bar, the weight of the moment settled in. They had a destination now. A station on the outer moon, a place where the artifact would change hands. Lyra walked beside John, her thoughts racing. This was just the beginning. Whoever had stolen the artifact was still out there, and they were closing in. The hunt was on. The next day, the stars outside the ship flickered as John and Lyra prepared for the final stretch of their journey. The outer moon station was close, and they could feel the tension in the air. The artifact they had been chasing for so long was finally within their reach, and they were ready to confront whoever was behind its theft. John sat at the controls, his hand steady as he guided the ship through the cold emptiness of space. Lyra sat beside him, her mind racing as she reviewed everything they knew. She had come a long way since the crash. Her memories were no longer fragments but a growing picture of the past. The betrayal, the artifact, and the mission. All of it was starting to make sense. But one question still lingered in her mind. Who could she trust? The station ahead loomed into view, a large, cold structure, floating in the darkness of space. It was surrounded by the vastness of the outer moons, a place where shady deals and hidden agendas often played out under the radar of the galaxy's authorities. "There it is," John said, his voice low. "The station." Lyra nodded, her gaze fixed on the floating structure. "This is it. We need to be careful." John brought the ship in closer, preparing to dock at one of the station's airlocks. The tension was palpable as they neared their destination. Lyra could feel her heart racing. She had been through many missions in her life, but this one felt different. This wasn't just about recovering an artifact. It was about facing the ghosts of her past, about confronting the betrayal that had cost her everything. The airlock hissed open, and they stepped into the station. The cold, sterile environment was a stark contrast to the warmth of the ship. Lyra took a deep breath, trying to steady herself as she followed John down the narrow corridor. The station was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The walls were lined with flickering lights, and the low hum of the station's systems was the only sound that filled the empty space. "This way," John whispered, leading the way down a series of hallways. The closer they got to their target, the more on edge Lyra felt. They had no idea what to expect. Whoever had the artifact could be anyone, and they could be anywhere. All they had were whispers and rumors. They reached a door at the end of the hallway. John paused, checking the console beside it. He gave a small nod. "This is it. The meeting point." Lyra's heart pounded in her chest. She was close now. So close. John glanced at her, his face set in determination. "Stay sharp. We don't know who we're dealing with." Lyra nodded, her fingers grazing the hilt of the small weapon she'd kept hidden on her belt. She wasn't going to let her guard down. Not this time. With a final glance, John opened the door. The room beyond was dimly lit, with shadows stretching across the walls. A single figure stood at the center, flanked by two others. The air was thick with tension. "You're late," the figure said, his voice cold. He was tall, with sharp features and eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. He didn't need to introduce himself. Lyra already knew who he was. The traitor. The man who had stolen the artifact and betrayed her. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The memories of her past rushed back. Her time in the Alliance, her role as a leader, the trust she had placed in this man. But now, seeing him face to face, there was only one thing that mattered. "Where is it?" she demanded, her voice steady but filled with anger. "Where is the artifact?" The man smiled, though it wasn't a pleasant smile. It was a smile full of arrogance and triumph. "You think you can just walk in here and take it from me? You failed once, Lyra. What makes you think you'll succeed this time?" John stepped forward, his hand on his weapon. "We're not here for a conversation. Give it to us." The man chuckled, his gaze flicking between John and Lyra. "You really don't understand, do you? The artifact isn't just an object. It's power, and power belongs to those who can control it." Lyra took a step forward, her fists clenched. "It's not yours to control. It was never yours to begin with. You betrayed everything I stood for." The man's smile faded, his expression turning colder. "I didn't betray anyone, Lyra. I did what was necessary. I saw the bigger picture. You were too blinded by your ideals to understand." "Stop talking," Lyra growled. "Where is it?" The man nodded toward one of his companions, a signal to move into action. In an instant, the two guards lunged toward them, weapons drawn. John was faster. He drew his sidearm and fired, taking out one of the guards before they could react. The other guard hesitated, and that was enough. Lyra moved swiftly, disarming him with a precise strike and sending him crashing to the ground. The man watched with a cold, calculating look in his eyes. Impressive. But you're still too late. The artifact is already gone. Lyra's blood ran cold. What do you mean gone? The man's smirk returned. It was sold. To the highest bidder. You were never meant to get it back. It's out of your reach now. Lyra took a deep breath, her mind racing. This was the moment she had been dreading. The artifact wasn't here, and they had nothing. But she couldn't let it end like this. She had come too far, fought too hard, to just give up now. You haven't won, she said, her voice hardening. I'll find it. I will find it, and I will stop you. The man's smile wavered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Good luck with that. With a final glance, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Lyra and John standing in the cold, silent room. They had lost the artifact, but the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.